Good afternoon, our friends, and thank you for joining us. I hope next year we'll be able to have our governance weekend in person and in Africa. We all miss the interaction, we miss the debates, the music, and the friendship. This year, our forum will focus on climate change and the challenges which are facing Africa. This is a big elephant in the room. And of course, we have some crises, COVID, Ukraine, etc. And people forget that major existential threat we have from climate. And in 6 months, COP27 will convene in Africa. And we need a coherent voice for Africa in Sharm el-Sheikh. We need to articulate Africa's case. We have been unable to do that so far. To start with, we, Africans, did not put this stuff up there. The rich, industrialized North did it. And actually, they continue to do it. The average carbon footprint of any European country or United States or even China is many, many times the footprint of the average African. So we did not put it up. We are not currently putting much up there, yet we are the guys who are most suffering from the consequences of what these guys did. Actually, the 10 most vulnerable countries which are really suffering from climate change, all the top 10 countries are African. Now, is this justice? Drought is destroying the livelihood of communities in Sub-Sahara, forcing wide-scale migration, creating frictions and conflicts between communities. We see that everywhere in Sub-Saharan Africa, and that this is destabilizing many of our countries. The number of internally displaced people in Africa due to climate is approaching 85 million people. 85 million people will be displaced within Africa due to climate change. Imagine what effect that will have in our continent and our people. Another challenge we face is how to power Africa. People forget or even don't realize that almost half of our population, almost 600 million people, don't have access to power, don't have access. Can you imagine how to live without electricity? What kind of work you can do? Education, hospitals. You don't have a life without electricity, without power. And we still talk about development. There's no development without power. Power is development. You can measure the development of any country by the amount of carbon actually put up there. That is the link between energy and development. Now, how are we gonna provide power to those people? At the same time, we are mindful of climate change. We don't want to put too much power. Actually, we are using a lot of renewable in Africa. People don't know that 22 African countries are almost completely relying on renewable. 22 countries in Africa, their main source of power there is renewable. No continent can match that. So we're already doing more than anybody in trying to really mitigate the crisis. But Of course, still we need to do more. And unfortunately, not every countries have access to hydropower, etc. And gas is an important transition for Africa to move forward. And Africa has a lot of gas. Many of it is down there, unexploited. That need to come out to help Africa and also to help other people who are now running around looking for gas. And we have plenty of gas reserves which need to be developed. Europe actually already imports half of African gas, African produced gas already. And yet some well-meaning people, some of our friends in the north, made a rather stupid decision at COP26 in Glasgow to stop financing gas projects in Africa. So people who put the carbon up there, yet they're denying Africa to develop its own gas resources while they're wallowing in Russian gas and in African gas. Is that not crazy? This is totally morally unacceptable from a continent which puts values at the center of its project. Values, European values. That's all what I hear when I go to Brussels. Values. This is the European project. Where are these values here, our friends? At the Africa-Europe Summit last February, Africans led by Macky Sall, the chair of the African Union, mounted a robust response. And our European friends appear at last to grasp the hypocrisy of that position. It is rather funny, strange, for them not to grasp how hypocrisy in that position they are taking. Interestingly, 1 week after the summit, Russia, unfortunately, invaded Ukraine. And as a consequence of that war, everybody in Europe now is running around looking for other sources of gas. Well, our gas is here. Come and help us to get that gas and sort your problem out. Finally, I don't want to speak too much because I think we have some interesting discussion following here. And I hope that you and all the people watching us will enjoy our 3 sessions. We have wonderful panelists, which I would like to thank. I also want to thank 2 wonderful ladies, Amina Mohammed and Kristalina Georgieva, who will be participating in our conference, and also our friend David Malpass, President of the World Bank. And I also like to express my gratitude for President Macky Sall, with whom I'm going to have a very robust discussion in 2 hours in his capacity as the head of the African Union, who need now to deal with this stuff and prepare our position as we go to Sharm el-Sheikh, which has to be an African conference. And I'm very delighted to now hand over to my wonderful sister, Zainab Badawi, who will be managing the event as usual. She always manages all our events. Thank you, Zainab, and it is yours now.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you. Thank you, Mo, and for your typically frank and robust comments in exposing, as you described it, the hypocrisy and stupidity of the global north when it comes to the double standard And as you say quite rightly, perhaps there is hope now that because of the tragic Ukraine war, that Africa will be allowed to develop its gas. I see that Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, was visiting Niger and South Africa and Senegal, so it looks like that dash for African resources is well in motion. So hello everybody, all these wonderful young people who are in the room with us. Sorry, Mo, but I like to, hang out with the young crowd. I don't know. I reserve that to say I'm with the young crowd. So I'm kicking off the first panel discussion of this governance weekend. And as Mo said, it's focusing on climate change and the road to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. So we're going to be talking about the impact of climate change in Africa and what Africa can do to really put the focus on the spotlight on Africa's concerns to do with climate change. We're very familiar with the mantra that Africa is the least responsible for global greenhouse gas emissions. Less than 3% of greenhouse gas emissions are emitted from Africa, and yet, as we always hear, the people of the continent are actually bearing a disproportionate burden from the impact of climate change. And we need to ensure that Africa's voice is really centre stage at the climate table debate, because obviously while the global north focuses a lot on mitigation, the other side of the coin is adaptation, which is of critical importance to Africa, because it has the largest number of floods in the world occur in droughts. The largest number of droughts occur in Africa, and Africa is the second continent after Asia that's most prone to floods. So you can see that we really need to build in our climate resilience. I've got a panel of 4, but I really invite questions and comments from you who are listening to this discussion online and people here in the audience. I've got some roving microphones, so I really want to make sure that you are very much part of this discussion. I'm going to kick off with my first panelist, Ibrahim Sheikh Diong, who's US Assistant Secretary General. He's director, sorry, I should say not he, but you, Ibrahim, you're director of the African Risk Capacity Group. You've had more than 30 years experience in leadership and management experience across continents, Asia, Africa, Europe, and so on. You're a senior banker. You've been a special advisor and ambassador at large for the president of Senegal, your native Senegal, and you've also served as the Africa director of the International Management Consultancy, Booz Allen Hamilton. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but we haven't got all afternoon to go through all your distinguished CV. So just kick off for us by just explaining to us what concerns you the most about climate and Africa in terms of what you think is really being overlooked, because I really want to focus in this debate on the hidden debate that's not normally aired. So just set the scene for us, Ibrahim.
Well, thank you, Zainab. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Let me just state the obvious, and that is what everybody recognizes by now as a consensus that Africa contributes less to climate change, but nevertheless, we see the impact on the continent. Let me highlight 4 areas of concern to Africa, because I had the luxury of attending the COP26 in Glasgow, and this seems to be the African voice as we march for COP27. Number 1 is that the loss and damages that climate change actually causes on the continent, and the human phase of climate change is what you talked about, the drought, the vulnerable community, the food insecurity on the continent, and that makes it extremely difficult for Africa to build its resilience. And I think what Africa is saying, because we contribute less in dealing with the resilience of the continent, it's important that those who act climate change be actually part of the responsibility in dealing with the loss of damages so we can save lives and livelihood. I think the second concern, equally important, Zainab, is that unfortunately, some of these climate problems, they don't just happen overnight. So early warning systems and modeling the risk and the exposure to climate change is important to Africa. So Africa having access to the most sophisticated technology when it comes to weather or climate change will help us as African governments, or African countries, I should say, at least to take the necessary measure in anticipation of the disaster to happen in climate change. I think the third concern for Africa, in Paris, there was a commitment made to provide $100 billion the next 10 years so that we can deal with adaptation on the continent. Obviously, the commitment has not been met. It has been made again at COP26. We're hoping by the time we get to Egypt, that commitment will begin to be met to Africa to at least have the resources to invest into adaptation as well. And I think last but not least is the energy transition. As Mo said earlier, we've discovered all these natural resources. We need them for our industrialization, for our development. And I think it's only fair for Africa to find a balance between actually developing its energy sector so they can industrialize, while at the same time we actually can play our role with regard to climate change. I think, again, let's say it, the human face of climate change at the continent is real. There are people actually who are affected on a daily basis by this. My organization is heavily involved in building the African resilience so that we can protect the livelihood of Africans as we adapt to climate change. Let me stop there, setting the scene, Zainab.
Thank you so much indeed for that, Ibrahim. And I think the particular issue of developing Africa's energy is going to be the subject of another panel discussion. So we'll park one of those points that you raised for another day. Marithi Matiga, you are the Africa Director for the International Crisis Group. You're based out there in Nairobi. You are indeed yourself Kenyan. And we know that there is this vicious cycle between climate change and conflict. The two are living off each other. So again, just paint a picture for us, kicking off, about what we can do to better integrate climate change into this whole, issue of conflict resolution and nation building.
Thanks, Zainab. It's always a pleasure to join you. And just to say that I'm not in Nairobi, actually, I'm just in Amsterdam for a conference that's run over a little bit, so I could dash back to, more settled areas. So there will be a bit of background noise. But just to say quickly, the interaction between climate and conflict is something that's still being studied. It's not true that, climate is a primary cause of a lot of conflicts that we see within the continent. But it is true that it is an accelerant. It contributes in ways that, as Mo mentioned, for example, in terms of displacement of population. Just to give you a couple of examples. In the last 2 years, 900,000 people in South Sudan have been displaced by flooding. That's a truly staggering number. To put it in context, that's almost 1 in 12 of the population. And I can guarantee if it's on that level in any other place in the world, it would be, headline news everywhere. And so, there's this combination of the number of shocks we've encountered around the world. That Mo mentioned, you have the COVID-19 pandemic. How did that affect pastoralists in the Horn of Africa? Well, it meant that the annual Hajj was cancelled in Saudi Arabia for 2 years, and therefore pastoralists could not sell their cattle and their goats, especially for 2 years. Their incomes were down, and then piled on top of that, you have 2 failed rainy seasons. And so you can see that the accumulation of shocks, COVID first, and then next you have the Ukraine crisis, as the Mo Ibrahim Foundation has captured very well. The rising commodity prices, the greater vulnerability in terms of family budgets. And so, for example, we currently have aid agencies moving to a direction where they give funds to people affected by hunger and by displacement. But then the funds they get go a much shorter way because of these rising commodity prices. And so how does this interact with conflict? So, we mentioned South Sudan, and with so many hundreds of thousands of people moving in a country already with very high rates of displacement in places where resources are already contested. We've seen in Equatoria, for example, the area around the capital, Juba, new arrivals be testing social relations because resources, as I mentioned, are scarce, and therefore you have the potential to accelerate conflict. It's very striking that over the last 2 years, climate stresses have been a much bigger driver of displacement in Somalia. Many of those people go into urban areas which already have stresses in terms of how many people they can accommodate. And so it's a challenge. What's to be done? I think one primary things we're advocating at Crisis Group is that people have to move beyond humanitarian responses. There needs to be very deliberate, long-term resilience building and very deliberate national and global policy making that aims to look at a sustainable way of helping the most vulnerable survive. As Mo mentioned, there will be the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. The African Union perhaps appointing a special envoy ahead of that to focus on climate, to really press home the message, that it's time to look at this in a focused way would be one potential step. But then national governments also need to step up and be more forward-leaning in terms of not just asking for humanitarian support, but looking at medium-term measures to build resilience. So I'll stop there for the opening.
Thank you very much indeed, Murithi, for those introductory comments. So I have two young ladies with me. I'll come to you in a moment, Amelia, but let's go to Natasha Kimani. You're from the MIF Now Generation Network, and you work in research and media at the Africa No Filter Group. So just picking up on what Murithi there said about, national governments have to step up to the plate, really. How do you think that countries should do that by ensuring that they take their own kind of, national specific policies and aims and integrate that into their development plans? How do they climate-proof their development?
Thanks, Zainab, and good afternoon, everybody. I think the first thing for national governments to do is actually simplify the conversation around climate change. Because currently, our data shows that Africa No Filter, only 4 out of 10 Africans know what climate change is. And only 28% have an understanding of the need and importance of climate action. And that there shows us that is a red flag. We are having conversations that are not involving the everyday African. So the first step I would take, and I would recommend for national governments, how can we integrate this conversation to ensure that it's not top level, that is in a way that excludes Africans from understanding the importance of actually, as an individual, taking the steps you need to take to ensure that your community is safe, that you're safe as an individual. That is the first thing. 2, implementing policies that are relevant and that reflect the everyday lives of Africans. When you say climate change to an unemployed 22-year-old who's struggling to survive and struggling to make ends meet, he's like, listen, I'm dying anyway. I don't have food on my table. So you're speaking this English that I don't understand. But if this climate change conversation is not going to impact my life, then I don't need it. So ensuring that when you're implementing these policies, you're making them in a way that reflect the challenges and are addressing the challenges that Africans are actually facing. And Murithi put it succinctly that 1, are we putting medium-term measures to ensure that we are addressing floods, we are addressing drought in the country, and are we being proactive rather than reactive? More importantly, are we localizing a lot of the conversations that take place in international forums and ensuring they reflect our context? Are we contextualizing the context and conversations around climate change? But most importantly, we need to highlight the small important things that Africans are doing in their communities. I find that largely the conversations around climate change are we implement scare tactics. There's a lot of doom and gloom. And while that is an important conversation to have, I think what's more important is to highlight the small and impactful ways Africans are making change in the continent, because that begins to shift the narrative. Africans begin to see, okay, well, if people like me are doing things like this, and I too can begin participating in the larger conversation around climate change, it's something that makes sense to me. then I can begin working in that space. So I think it's important for us to shift the narrative, localize our conversations and implement policies and programs that are relevant. And I think also do it from an early age. We shouldn't be having conversations when people are old and struggling to understand what climate change is. How can we implement this in our education systems where young people are able to understand the importance of protecting their environments and protecting their communities, the importance of being more proactive rather than reactive? So those are some of the things I would recommend national governments to begin thinking about when we think about climate action and involving everyday Africans in the step to ensuring change, but most importantly, long-term change.
Thank you, Natasha. Thanks very much indeed, Natasha. Amelia Sewingwa, you're an advocate for the rule of law and sustainable development, and you are a human rights lawyer, and you're founder of a non-profit organisation which advances accountability and innovative sustainable development. So what you just heard Natasha there say must resonate with you. I mean, how do you really ensure that no one is left behind when we are talking about Africa and climate change?
Thank you, Zainab, and it's a real privilege for me to be here today to share my views. There's a huge leadership gap, and a huge part of leadership requires empathy. And when we talk about not leaving anyone behind, a big aspect of that goes to the issue of the human face and the human voice. But more importantly in this debate, the African face and the African voice. The biggest concern for me when we're looking at issues around accountability is the fact that our policies are not being driven by the right push. I come from southern Tanzania, from the southern highlands, which is the breadbasket of Tanzania and potentially the region. And what we've witnessed last year and this year is not only flooding, but droughts that has yielded no harvest. And so I'm looking at people who are my relatives who have been unable to pursue their livelihoods, to send people to school, to access healthcare. This is where empathy needs to resonate with our leadership. This is where I think there's a huge gap and where we need to seek accountability. Policies in Africa, when I look at Tanzania, for instance, look at climate change from a very general perspective. It doesn't talk about how the governments can actually have practical plans that can impact people like my aunts and cousins. People who are looking for access to basic education, looking for access to basic healthcare. And this is the conversation that we need to be having, recognizing that there is intersectional environmentalism aspects where we're not just talking about melting ice caps, penguins and polar bears, but real people.
Thank you very much indeed. So, all right. Let me get some response now from our audience here. You've heard a lot of very interesting points raised there, the need for greater climate resilience and having early warning systems, because you can't stop droughts happening, you can't stop rain coming and causing floods and so on. So you've got to build in the resilience. A lack of money coming from the global community, the need for governments to have, better tailored national climate policies, and you've just heard about how the debate perhaps is dominated by one from the global north, which is all about polar bears and melting ice caps and so on, and not an African face of an unemployed 22-year-old person or somebody who's been displaced because of climate changes. Marithi was telling us, or through a lack of water. So let me ask you first of all, because Natasha says something which I found quite startling from Africa No Filter, that 40%, 4 out of 10 Africans, was it Natasha, you said 4 out of 10 Africans are not aware of what climate change is? Actually
yes.
Don't. So just expand on that a little bit. And I want to ask you, audience, whether you are surprised by that statistic. So when you say don't understand what climate change is, we're not being patronising here about Africans, because they are very aware of what's going on in their environment. So perhaps you could just elucidate. What do you mean by they don't know anything about climate change?
Absolutely. So our respondents informed us that they've heard about this over and over, perhaps in the radio or television, but they don't know what that is. And perhaps no one has taken the time out to engage them or expound on the importance of climate change, but or what it is.
They experience it. They experience it. But they don't necessarily use the terminology of climate change and global warming. But it is a concept not understood. Okay, but if they are aware of it, do they ask that people should act on it? I mean, or is it just, blissful ignorance? Or what do you mean? I mean, are they aware of what's happening and want a solution without necessarily labelling it climate change?
Absolutely. Africans do know they want solutions. They want, and let me give an example of farmers. Farmers are aware that there's been a long drought, which means there's no food to put on their tables, which means they're unable to go to the market to make any money. So they don't think of solutions in terms of climate change. They just know they need solutions. And sometimes they think, listen, our government is failing us, which is partly true, but it never connects towards the fact that this is actually also a climate change challenge. So they're aware that there are problems, but they're not quite clear that climate change is the issue here.
Got it. Ibrahim, does it make any difference if they don't necessarily give it the label climate change? Why does it matter if they're demanding solutions?
Well, I will stay away from the semantic and focus actually on the human face of climate change. And the reality is, as we say, whether it's drought, tropical cyclone, or flood on the continent, the millions of people whose lives are affected because of food security or because of other disasters you see on the continent. The question is, what do we do about as Africans in terms of finding solutions? I think that's where I want to underscore the importance of, first of all, leadership toward COP27, whereby Africa be on the driver's seat and show that we're actually finding solutions ourselves. And then second, investment. So when commitments are made to put more money on the table for us to deal with it, that investment is actually made. And also commitment in terms of making sure that the money has been actually committed by the international community. When we want to invest into adaptations and mitigation, that money is actually brought forward so that we Africans will contribute less, have what it takes to early warn, but at the same time to invest so that we can protect life and livelihood.
Okay, got it.
I had the opportunity in visiting communities in Senegal that are affected by COVID-19 and drought. Tell me, lives are being affected. We have no time to waste on semantic. We need to save them.
Okay, all right. So I've been accused of semantics here. However, it was quite startling. But Saad Mohammed says to you, Natasha, thank you for your remarks. I was wondering if you can share your studies on climate change and awareness of African people. So obviously a very eye-catching find there. Konzanani Malambo, long point Konzanani's made, but says there seems to be a lack of political will in some African countries. So let's just focus on the African countries at the moment, and then we'll come on to the international community for a while. Who wants to make a comment on the lack of political will? Lady in the red jacket there. And I should apologise, by the way, for my voice, because I've just recovered from COVID, so it's taken quite a toll on my voice. Stand up, introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, distinguished panelists. Thank you, Mo. I come from Africa, I come from Botswana. The topic here today is let us focus on Africa. Natasha's statement that 4 out of 10 countries, people show that they don't understand what is climate change. I want to differ. Africans have always found a way of adapting to climate change. We have relied on indigenous knowledge. We know how we used to be harvesting water for the next season, for the next drought. I think this is the right time to define climate change in the African standards. And let's leave out the definition from the international community. Africans have always experienced these droughts, as far as I remember. It's just that now this is becoming worse. The other point that I want to make, which I think it will be controversial, we are talking about policy. My sister here was saying climate change is a human rights issue. Yes, it's a human rights issue. I stand here to say, as African countries, it's high time we take blame or we charge those who are responsible for emitting emissions. They be charged for human rights abuse. Because we see people suffering because of climate change. And this is a human rights issue. If we can take people to the High Court in The Hague for trampling on human rights issues, why can't we take the developed countries to task for emitting the emissions and not look at COP26? Africa made the most NDCs which give us less hope. But look at what they did. This is negotiation in bad faith. They come in front of us and tell us, you don't have to mine gas. I want Africa to use this opportunity, take the Ukraine-Russia crisis to produce our own gas. Look at what happened on the divergence on the vaccine manufacturing. When they took all the vaccines for themselves, Africa came together and said, we can do it under the leadership of Ramaphosa. So why can't we take this opportunity and say we can do it for our own people? We can produce our own gas.
Okay.
We don't necessarily need them to tell us that they are not going to fund our gas. We can leverage on the private sector and de-risk.
Very difficult for Africa to develop its own gas. Who agrees with this?
I'm a 2021 Mo Ibrahim Fellow attached to UNECA under the mentorship of Vera Songwe.
Thank you. Who agrees? Show if you agree with this lady by applauding. Got quite a lot there. Okay, Amelia, is that feasible? Is it viable that Africa could say we are bearing the brunt of global greenhouse gas emissions? We want to take you to the, well, I doubt the ICC would be welcome, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I mean, but perhaps the International Court of Justice or some other judicial mechanism. Is that really feasible?
It's difficult today because of political will. Our leaders at the moment don't even recognize socioeconomic rights as being justiciable. Many of our constitutions today on the continent do not allow an African to go to court and say that my local government, central government, or even a private entity is encroaching on my socioeconomic rights. How then do we translate this to a global stage? It's difficult. However, if more voices start speaking about these issues, that could make the difference.
All right. My panel remote. Does anybody want to respond on these comments that we've just heard? Marithi, we've not heard from you for a while.
Yeah, no, just quickly, I'll just give a couple of anecdotes from my own life. I remember in the late 90s, I could be wrong, but I think it was 1997, there was a vicious drought in Kenya. Most people didn't understand what the cause was, but I remember vividly reading for the first time about the concept of El Nino and then La Nina. The next year, there was very substantial floods, and El Nino and La Nina became household names. It was quite extraordinary. It's true that, you always have these cycles of drought and floods, but it was very intense. But what's striking about what we are living through in the Horn of Africa at the moment is that it's become almost a way of life. It's unheard of since records began for you to have 4 seasons of El Nino, 4 seasons of failed rain, and then, followed by La Nina inevitably. And so, yes, I agree, as Natasha mentioned, to move towards very proactive solutions. I think we need to recognize that this has become almost a way of life. I think what we should at least acknowledge is that the science is as good as it has ever been. The capacity to predict these disastrous cycles, what the precise temperature rises will be, when the flooding will occur, is very good. But the policy-making capacity has not kept up. And then I'll just close by saying, very interesting from the lady from Botswana. I remember Ahmed Musa, who is a very good researcher from Somaliland on these issues, made the point that much of Somalia has a very similar climatic posture to Botswana. But when was the last time you heard about a famine or a famine in Botswana? So we have to remember that there's a very tight link between these climate stresses taking the leap into becoming a human emergency, between climate stresses and governance. So governance is absolutely critical, and we need to learn from countries like Botswana in terms of proactive solutions and supporting, especially livestock keepers.
All right, thank you. So the lady from Botswana, did you actually give your name? I'm not sure you did.
I gave my name. My name is Hao Sobata. Hao Sobata.
How Sabat? Sorry, I must have missed that there. Okay, thank you. It's just when you
Call
said,
me Hao.
yeah, when you said the lady from Botswana. Anybody else want to come in on the panel? Ibrahim, Natasha?
Yes,
Okay.
I think what I will say, maybe I'll let Natasha go first. Natasha, go ahead.
Yes, I think I'm just going to say, add on to what House said and say that we were actually saying the same thing. While Africans are unaware of the concept of climate change, they have been doing they have been working on different ways to survive in their own contexts. And I think the challenge to us is we need to begin telling our own narratives and stories, because the dominant narratives and stories out there about Africa are doom and gloom, that the world is ending and the first people to die are going to be Africans. But I want to challenge that a bit and say, the world may be ending, but I'm hoping we're not going to be the first to go. And in fact, I know we won't. And it is because in our own small context, we have been doing things in our communities, in our own languages to protect our environment. And we need to begin telling these stories, because what then is going to happen is we are going to begin working on policies that are more localized and understand the nuances of each country and each continent and each context. And I think that is important for us to do, begin telling different stories, because the current stories are not doing us any justice.
All right, Ibrahim, you can come in immediately.
I think what I'll add, as opposed to talking about the international court of justice, I'm talking about more responsibility and accountability. And I think in this case, the case has been made over and over again about the responsibility, or the shared responsibility, shall I say. I have a much more practical approach by saying, look, what does Africa need today when it comes to climate change? I think we talked about the national policies being embedded into our national policies so we can take climate change and disaster more seriously. That's the responsibility of Africans. We should make sure our government are accountable in doing so. I think second, Africans are saying we need the capacities so we can do early warning system and anticipate. Look at South Africa. The flood that happened there, a lot of people were saying, maybe if the early warning system worked, maybe you could have saved some life. That's a debate to be had with the South Africans. So I think we're saying let's build our capacity so we actually, no one is left behind when it comes to early warning system. What Africans are also saying in terms of accountability, if you come up with an adaptation investment plan, the 100 billion have been promised by the international community need to be made available, accessible, so we can invest into our adaptation plan as well. And last but not least, what Africans are saying, their lives involved. This is not a joke. We're talking about people's lives being affected. Let's make sure that we tell the stories where we can be impactful to demonstrate we are working for the African people and not the other way around.
Okay. Ibrahim, I've got to ask you this, question from me, but we hear this 100 billion in the Green Fund that's been pledged, and it's not coming. When are Africans going to actually say, look, what's the point of going on and on about this? The money hasn't arrived. I don't think it's going to come anytime quickly, is it, really? So could you think of something else to do rather than just saying the global north is not coming up with the money that it should? Because actually it's a drop in the ocean for what Africa really, really needs. So, I mean, you're not really getting anywhere, are you, for years and years, saying that more should be put in this fund from the global north? It's time to change the record, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the good news, Zaina, we're hosting COP27. If Africa does not make the point at the COP27 that this is important for Africa, we will not get an opportunity again. That's one thing. And second, at COP26, let's face it, there's some promise to be made in terms of adaptation fund with the African Development Bank, the Global Center on Adaptation. So that money is coming in. My concern, when the money is available, the Africans have to have an adaptation strategy, adaptation investment plan, so we can channel the funding into where it's needed, so actually we can invest in the right project on the continent. So the responsibility, it's the money, but we as Africans, are we structured, organized, and get the investment that we need, whereby we can channel the funding to where the adaptation is actually required. And that's why I think we need to get ourselves organized and then keep pushing so the funding will come true. So hopefully it will come true at COP27. I'm very optimistic about it.
I'm with you. I mean, I know Ban Ki-moon is doing a very good job at this new Global Center for Adaptation, and Kitna Deshina at the African Development Bank has said Our climate strategy is essentially adaptation, not mitigation, which is the priority for the global north. So yes, that message is coming through, but I was making the point about the money. You're not going to get the money. Anyway, you can keep on asking for it, but it won't come. We're not in the amounts that we need anyway. Some questions here. Anybody want to say something from the floor, please? Please, 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 put your hand up. Yeah, a gentleman there and a gentleman there with the hat and with the tie. And we're getting here comments about Africans need more understanding of what climate change is, what causes it, what we can do to minimize it as a community. And as young people, we are willing regularly to go to Africa and help educate communities. Transforming our mindset is key. So that's a comment there from Konzanini Malambo. Yet again, that's another one. Konzanini is very busy this afternoon. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is
yourself.
Kwame Biko. I'm from Ghana. I'm
Yeah.
currently at the London Business School. And I have a question about just the selective statistics that seems to happen a lot when it comes to these areas. For example, I heard several years ago that Malawi was about to be sanctioned by Norway for, on a relative basis, and 100% increase on per capita emissions, per capita of the population. But Norway is actually 75 times more on an absolute basis. So how do we ensure African countries are not penalized in this way? Thank you.
Right, okay. I think, Ibrahim, that might be one for you. That doesn't resonate with me, that you think you've read somewhere that Malawi is being penalized.
Several years ago, there was an announcement of a potential sanction from Norway because of the increase in the...
On Malawi?
On Malawi, that's right.
Because of the increase of its use of...
On per capita emissions.
Oh, right. Ibrahim, does that ring a bell with you?
It does not ring a bell, but I do know that Malawi is very much focused and active on resilience for drought and flood, as opposed to dealing with a sanction from Norway. So I think what's important for Malawi right now is the fact that the drought coming up, and in fact, a very good news, we're about to write a big check to Malawi to help protect actually the vulnerable communities that are affected by drought. And that's resilience that the African Union is involved in. I'm very much focused on the solution, not on the sanction of Malawi, because I don't think they're responsible compared to, at least, I haven't heard that statistic before, but it's certainly an interesting news that I haven't heard before.
But it is interesting that Norway, with its largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, about 1.3 trillion, most of it derived, of course, from its export of oil and gas. But anyway, we move on from that particular point. Yes, the person with the hat. The man with the hat. Thank you.
Okay, hello, thank you. My name is Mustafa Said. I'm from Nigeria and I'm a student of African International Development at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also a member of the Now Generation Forum. For me, I just wanted to take us a bit back to where we talked about the fact that there is still local context in Africa, that people experience climate change. Yes, I mean, people have always experienced climate change, right? I think what we need to do is that while we recognize that there is that local context in Africa, we also need to move toward globalizing the local context. And globalizing the local context in Africa means that we need that 22-year-old young person in a rural village in Nigeria or in Botswana to know that this drought is caused by the fact that industrialized countries are emitting so much, and this is what is heating up the world, right? So the whole importance of people understanding the language of climate change is for them to put the right effort when it comes to holding institutions accountable. Like Natasha said, while governments, local governments in Africa are partly responsible for some of the constraints that rural dwellers face when it comes to climate change, there is also, for me, the elephant in the room, and that is the industrialized countries who are emitting so much. So our ability to educate people and localize the knowledge of climate change is important because it's going to help us have that kind of grassroots accountability of people holding industrialized governments accountable, so that when civil society organizations go to COP27, for example, in Sharm el-Sheikh, they will be able to speak with so much justification that they are representing voices of people in the grassroots, not because they have the knowledge to represent those people, but because they've been able to educate those people at the grassroots who are mostly impacted by climate change to now say that you have our voices, go and speak for us. And that has been my point always.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Amelia, I think you want to respond to the young man.
I do. I actually think that the elephant in the room is the fact that our leaders, when they come to the global stage, fail to make the case for Africa. For me, my biggest concern is the fact that I'm not sure my president can actually articulate climate justice issues. Can she speak to benefits, burden, and responsibility? Can she speak to the issues around the just transition? Would she be able to know what that is? Do we understand the mitigation strategy and ensuring we don't leave any workers behind? This is my biggest challenge. It's really not even the fact that industrialized countries don't understand the case that we're making. They do. The issue is that when we're given the opportunity to speak about it, we're not doing it. And this is why COP27 is essential. The African face and voice must be included in the discussion, but that means that our leaders need to bring that argument to the table. And that's my biggest fear.
So, yeah, thank you. You brought up another elephant. There are going to be so many elephants in the room soon. We're all going to have to vacate. There won't be any space for us, starting with Mo's first elephant. Yes, this young lady, I saw you nodding very much when Amelia was speaking there. Just introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Adila. I'm from Mauritius. Emilia, excellent point. And it's the very idea we are trying to hold our government leaders accountable. But we have to understand, we have to ask first and foremost whether our government leaders understand the implications of climate change and which is happening. Muruti as well mentioned the issues around farming and access to resources that are being exacerbated. And the fact that whether question our government leaders, our representatives, whether they can connect the dots, that what is happening and the exacerbation of things is actually related to climate change and other issues we are encountering around pandemic, to connect the dots. So that awareness that we are talking about, whether at our citizens levels, as mentioned by Natasha, yes, that's one thing, but the other things, whether our leaders as well have the correct knowledge to be able to question things and to challenge and to connect the dots so that they are able to represent us at COP27.
The question back to you, do they have that knowledge and that ability to connect the dots?
From my experience, okay, I'm here and I'm going to make controversial statements. At my country level, perhaps not enough, or it is only at a superficial level. So not in depth and not much engaged. And we are not leading perhaps by examples yet.
Do most people agree with that? National governments are not pulling their weight? You do. Okay, good. All right. Fabrice, introduce yourself. And then there are two more ladies there. Thank you very much indeed. There's afterwards, we'll hand it over. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, thank you so much. Fabrice Muchiga from the DR Congo and from the Now Generation Network. And one thing I do agree, actually, I think Ibrahim mentioned that. If we don't set the agenda, somebody will set it for us. And time has come for Africa to set the agenda. But I'm very frustrated by one thing. It's really frustrating the hypocrisy around the climate change debate. Mo mentioned that actually about the gas issue, and we have been able to see that with the war in Ukraine. You know, after they stop funding, they come for our gas. We could name many other examples. Another one would be the 100 billion that some people do not believe we'll see, you know. So this is really a big issue of trust. So my frustration is, how do we still believe that the people we didn't trust in Glasgow, the commitment have not been met? What makes us believe that they will meet them right now? This is really becoming very frustrating, and I agree with the idea of really thinking about other alternatives. So the question is, what are the tools that we have for making pressure so that we make our case as Africa? You know, I know, for example, the impact are real. We have assets in all our countries. We have cobalt in the Congo, you know, and this is very important for the electric vehicles. The Congo Basin we mentioned, and we have other opportunity other places. So how can we stand strong as Africa to leverage on this? And then the issue will come again, how can we really come with one voice of Africa? And it's really remaining frustrating if we are not able to come with that voice. And thank you.
So I'm hearing two things here. Yeah, go, let him relish his applause. Go on then. Okay. Happy now, Fabrice? Okay, good. So I'm hearing two things here. What national governments need to do and to step up to the plate, but also this theme of the hypocrisy that you're seeing from the international community in terms of not sharing the priorities that Africa has, adaptation, less than mitigation, and not providing the funding, and also, whether commitments made at COP26, as you were saying, Fabrice, will actually be observed. I mean, already within the Global North context, people are saying that they're not going to be meeting the commitments that they themselves have made, because they're all rushing to open up and get the coal out of the hole again, and, building nuclear plants and changing their whole strategies in the light of the Ukraine conflict. Okay, fine. Yes, the gentleman in the red pullover. And then there was another person here and there. Yeah. Let's take a couple at a time. Go
on. Good afternoon. My name is Tupua Lesinko, Birmingham scholar for the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Probably the last born in the room for the scholarship. And I promised one of my bosses that I was going to ask a question. So just in case she's in the room, she may be following.
An elephant this time in the room. Sorry, go on, yes.
So my question is basically twofold. And one, in terms of African capacity, at least at the highest level, to grapple well with the climate question, I think we are not yet at that level. And for me, I picture African leaders, for example, attending the Glasgow COP26 forum as just passengers boarding a London-bound coach with a driver maybe from overseas, and they just know where they are going, but the mission is not clear. And the main justification for that is that Africans have not owned the climate agenda, at least at their own personal level. It's still a kind of a proposal drafted in a boardroom in Europe, though it's an existential threat to us. But at our own individual level, we've not internalized and conceptualized it. And as such, reforms, mitigations, and adaptations mechanisms being proposed still do not warrant our situation in Africa. And that takes me to one of the question that, rather comment that was said that Africa must understand and conceptualize climate change in their own way and fashion their own reforms and remedies.
All right.
Because as it stands, for example, and I saw that in the facts and figures, for example, on the issue of energy, Europe is selling the idea of please Africa abandon gas, for example, and shift to completely new energy mechanisms. There's a large energy deficit to help bridge the development gap, and telling Africa that is akin to just holding them on the ground, because it's not totally possible. One, because where, for example, I come in the rural areas, I use firewood, for example, to cook. You are telling me, move out of firewood to maybe LPG gas, and there isn't infrastructure in the first place. And so basically, we're having two people conversing at a table where one completely does not have a bargain. And so that then brings the efforts needed to a kind of back and forth where it's not yielding any effort. And so I think we still need to have that honest conversation, and Africa must set the agenda and come to the table.
Got that.
Well-versed and well having a proper outlook, because I don't think we have...
Not to be the passenger, but to be the driver. Let me just ask you very quickly, thank you, because let me just, before you hand over the mic, do you think African leaders are that bothered about climate change, that they care about climate change?
I don't think so, because even I think at COP26, I'm sorry to say so, but I saw some of the Zimbabwean delegation, they were actually maybe pictured doing shopping in Glasgow instead of attending a forum. But I think, that was on light note, but I think in terms of maybe the best people to drive the climate change agenda in Africa, because certainly our leaders are out of question,
okay, all right,
is the civil society.
You think our civil society?
Civil society. And
put up your hand if you agree with this gentleman that African leaders don't care about climate change. You think they don't care. So, and who thinks they do care about climate change? For only one. Well, what happened to all the other? What happened to all the other? Only one person thinks that African leaders take climate change seriously. And most think they don't. Right, very interesting. I hope African leaders are listening to this Ibrahim governance discussion, because there's some food for thought for you. Yeah, go on, Ibrahim. And panel, please just jump in at any time. Yeah, go on, Ibrahim. Yeah, hand the mic to you.
Well, look, I can beg to defer that the African leaders actually don't care about climate change. I think we need to segment the advocacy requirement here. It's not just about the African leaders. The civil society, the African think tank, the African academic, the Mo Ibrahim of the world, all of us have to be responsible and make sure the advocacy for climate change in Africa is something that we do collectively together so we can get the message loud and clear from a different perspective. The idea of expecting an African leader to be on the driver's seat all the time, to me, it's just the old way of doing things. One of my biggest passions, Zainab, is to convince African leaders to be the ambassadors of the work that we do, so out there they can go and talk about what Africa is actually doing in climate change. I think second, on the leadership side, I beg to differ a little bit. If I look at my organization, it was created in 2012 by the African Union, entirely dedicated to helping African governments to plan, prepare, and respond to weather-related disasters. And things we've been on board, about $1 billion have been provided and protect about 100 million people on the African continent against flood, tropical cyclone, and then drought in some cases. But we could do more of that. And I think we need as many initiatives as possible and not wait for the international community to come to our rescue so we can save lives. And I think that's where, in my view, we need to be focusing our energy. So when we go to COP27, it's not just about advocacy, it's showcasing what we're doing as Africans that are successful, that we can do more, so we can actually multiply those initiatives and make sure we can save life and livelihood. So that way, we're part of the solution as opposed to just being part of the problem.
Okay, he's got a strategy. You're a man with a strategy, Ibrahim. The role of advocacy as well as a showcase. Yeah, go ahead, Natasha. Yeah.
I want to challenge Ibrahim slightly. And on a light note, some of the people at the conference may not be allowed back into their countries once their governments watch the comments. But back to my point is that there's a phrase in policy making that funding follows functions. So African governments are great at policy making. I think we have some of the best policies on the continent, but does funding follow the functions and the policies we've created? And there's a resounding no on that. And that just shows you where the priority is. So it's great for an African leader to go to an international panel and say, I have fantastic legislation. But when you follow that up and say, well, okay, what have you been doing in that particular space? How have you integrated climate change in your different ministries? Often you'll find silence. And that goes to show, well, on paper, we are great at commitment. But when it comes to implementation, there's a huge gap. I also want to challenge Ibrahim slightly, and please, may this not hinder any future employment opportunities at the UN, by saying that...
Don't worry, I'm going to give him a right to reply. Yeah, go on.
By saying that oftentimes when we say, you know, it should be collective responsibility, that's an African leader's way of excusing himself from responsibility. While collective responsibility is important, the foremost responsibility is that of African governments. And we need to reiterate that and hold them accountable. One, you cannot expect them to be accountable and represent us internationally when they don't do it nationally. So what are you doing nationally? Second, what are you doing regionally? If we see changes on the continent, then we can be confident and say, okay, our African leaders are going to represent us internationally. But currently, there's no faith in that, because oftentimes, I'm not going to respond to the comment about African leaders shopping when they come to Europe. I just think sometimes we stay quiet because often we are on the losing end stick of negotiations, and the power dynamics don't give us the opportunity to push for what we need. And that is the elephant in the room. We could talk about changes all we want, but what is the bargaining power that African leaders have? It's quite minimal. So perhaps that's a conversation we need to have.
Okay.
Think about,
Okay. Sorry, yeah. Oh, Ibrahim, she's wiped that smile off your face. I mean, like, please be my guest. Right to reply. Go on.
You know, when I was told that Zainab would actually moderate the session, I expected to be challenged. So I am not surprised, Natasha, for the challenge. And but look, I think collective responsibility does not necessarily mean that the African government do not have to fulfill the responsibility. After all, they've been elected to lead the nation, so therefore they have responsibility in having the right public policy. What I'm saying, the culture of climate change and disastrous management is not embedded into a public policy or a discourse. So in making sure when we do the advocacy work, it's important that we don't just look at the top down and make sure the different stakeholders are involved in making sure we get the message across so we can take this more seriously. So once you've done actually that advocacy work, I agree with you. We need the investment, we need the strategy, we need the commitment, we need actually some innovative way in making sure we can protect life and livelihood.
Okay,
so my point being, that's basically to say that responsibility has to be shared,
all right.
But maybe there are more responsibility than others in terms of the responsibility sharing.
We've got some more comments from the floor here. Thanks, Ibrahim. Yes, the young lady.
Hi, my name is Hanan Tayfour, and I'm from Sudan, and I was the Mo Ibrahim Fellow in 2020-2021 at the International Trade Center. I just wanted to touch on Natasha's point about that we don't have, bargaining power or a leg to stand on, and I don't think that's true because Africa is so resource rich. Everything, all the minerals, all the assets that we have here make the world function, especially when there's going to be a revolution in terms of green financing. All the assets and the minerals are here. I just feel like that we need to leverage that more and come collectively and use it as a bargaining power tool to put forward better positions and ask for more financing from our end. So I think Africa holds the key. We just need to come together and as a collective voice as well.
Thank you very much indeed. That's great. Nice to see fellow Sudanese there making nice, brief, to the point comments. Yes, hand it to the lady in the spectacles. Yep, oh, sorry.
Normally I wear spectacles.
No, I thought it was going to your friend next to you.
It's okay.
Either that or I'm going blind. Yes, go on, introduce yourself.
Yes, so my name is Barka Musai. I'm the Blue Economy Advisor at the African Union Commission, but I'm here obviously as an Ibrahim Foundation Scholar alumni. And my comment is very quick. Essentially what Hanan said about Africans not having bargaining power is really not true. Look at when elections happen at UN level. The vote bank is Africa, 54 member states. So this just shows how important Africa is. It's just that we don't use it. And the bargaining power can also be found by curating the data, the experiences, and the insights from our people. Some delegations actually integrate youth in their official COP delegations. Most African countries don't. And we miss out on that aspect, that perspective that young people provide, which is both supporting a national position, but also a civil society position. So young people are actually the bridge between different aspects, different sectors of the negotiations. There's also the different university and data that is being produced that we're not using effectively. We assume that there's a data black hole in Africa, which is really, really not true. There are many efforts being made and many brilliant scholars on the continent who just need that platform. We need to use that. A lot of the women who are producing data also have the community level experience. I read somewhere that, for example, every dollar invested in a woman in agricultural resilience yields at least $35 in revenue. And this is the kind of experience that we should be curating to support the African position at COP level. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight that when the pandemic happened, and this is like really, we should not let it go out of our collective memories. All the countries banded together, putting together money, even at the African Union Commission, which at the African Union level, which can be a slow-moving organization. Leaders came together really, really fast to put together funds, to pledge, to seek out partners. But towards the tail end of the pandemic, not that I'm saying the pandemic is over, we developed something called the Green Recovery Action Plan, which provided a pathway for merging economic recovery with meeting NDC targets. And this was supported by South Africa's Africa Green Stimulus Program as well. And that's the kind of program that already exists that we should really be leveraging.
Okay.
And finally, the last thing.
You started off by saying just a brief comment, but
no, it's just that
you've got a very elastic definition of brief.
No,
That's all
the
I
last
can
one
say.
is also quite pertinent.
Briefly,
which is that there are many streams of engagement with negotiations. There's CAHOSC, there's the Africa Group of Negotiators. Where are the entry points for the average African with these different bodies and for African leaders?
All right, okay,
so
thank
those
you.
are my comments. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, who else wants to speak? Yes, you've been waiting for a long time. Very smart young man there in his three-piece suit. Yes, give him the microphone. Deserves a special microphone. Yes.
Thank you, Zainab. Okay, I will be brief.
We don't believe that, but go on, yes.
I just wanted to rehash one or 2 points. First off, on the conversation that my name is Manji Wilson from Nigeria, Now Generation Network member. The conversation around Africans not understanding what climate change is all about. One point that I wanted to raise is that at several fronts, the conversations have been largely technical. So a large percentage of Africans that are impacted by this hear a lot of these big terminologies that we tend to raise in interactions as this or other fora. However, at the micro level, at the rural communities, where this impact is largely felt, there is a need to simplify what we're talking about when it comes to the issue of climate change. I want to rehash a point that Ibrahim has been mentioning, but it just seems to be on the sideline, and is the issue of numbers. We talk about 100 billion, we talk about these numbers, and we talk about monies and all that, and we forget about the value of the human life. He talks about saving life, and I think the conversation about climate change has to do a lot more about what the value of human life is. With the research that has been done by Mo Ibrahim Foundation, you could realize that from just the impact of non-use of cooking gas to the traditional means of firewood that was mentioned by my friend earlier, or other means, more than 600,000 Africans die as a result of bad health situations. We have so many more pandemics that are exacerbated by the impact of climate change. And we need to begin to look at the fact that we are talking about the value of a human life here, and not just about some monies or some figures out there or this commitment. If we think about that, then these numbers for currency or whatever amount will no longer matter, and we'll take up an emergency action to address these issues. Thank you.
Amelia, just respond to that, Amelia. That's music to your ears, isn't it?
It is, and that's why I opened by talking about the Southern Highlands in Tanzania and putting real faces to it. People who are not able to send children to school, people who are not able to access healthcare simply because their livelihoods have been affected by climate change. When we go into the rural area, we don't speak about climate change. One, because I can't translate that into Kiswahili. I don't know how many of you. Not at all. Climate change?
Yeah.
No, it's a lengthy sentence.
You define it? What would you, how do you?
I would say matatizo ya mazingira.
And what does that mean?
If I translate that talks about environmental challenges. I cannot translate climate change into a local language. So that's already the problem. So what we need to be able to do is speak about the stories, about what's happening on the ground. So when I go in and I speak about what is your current situation with regards to agriculture? They'll tell me, well, we deal with rain-fed agriculture. We have not had rain this year. And as a result, my children have been sick and I haven't been able to take them to the hospital. I've not been able to pay for their school fees and a myriad of other challenges. Then we're able to create a new narrative that we can then take to local government or as civil society come in and see what interventions we can put in place as a result. this is the challenge. If we have more African voices speaking about climate change and how it impacts them on an everyday basis, real African stories, I hope that would move our leaders, because I'm assuming they have parents and aunts and nephews and nieces as well, and recognize that when they go to the negotiation table, they're not just going shopping in Glasgow, but they're really bringing real issues to the table that need to benefit the average African.
So implicit in what you say is that African leaders are not sufficiently alive to this.
I think, one, they don't quite understand the issue enough to be able to, let me say, intelligently articulate
you're
the
being
issue.
diplomatic. You want to get back to Tanzania, I know. Yes. Yeah. All right. Okay. Marithi, we've not heard from you for a long time. So this, putting a human face on climate change and not funds. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating discussion. Just to follow up on a couple of comments from the floor in terms of potential and bargaining power. I would say that on the positive side of the ledger is that Africa is coming from a very low base. And that's good news. I would really commend a book by the Harvard professor Calestas Juma from Kenya, sadly departed a couple of years ago. But he pointed out that Africa could easily produce 60% of the world's food needs. Africa is the continent that uses the least amount of tractor-powered agriculture. Africa is the continent where the level of rain-fed dependence is highest. So the level of irrigation is lowest. And so I think there's great potential. Mo will know better than anyone else in the room. When the mobile technology revolution came in, Africa leapfrogged because it came from a very low base, because the fixed telephones run by the state were so bad. Everybody embraced mobile telephony and therefore could get to the next level, including on mobile money, very quickly. Right. So I think when we talk about leverage resolutions, I think we should know that there's a lot of potential and we could easily power ahead very quickly. And just finally, or as a Nigerian friend said, finally, I'll just say briefly that look at the Ukraine crisis. We have a lot of gas on the continent. This is the time to drive again. The Indians have shown, for example, they're getting oil from Russia at a very low price. They're using that to power their economy. They're even helping Sri Lanka stay afloat. There is a major crisis in the world, but if we look at it from an optimistic perspective, from a problem resolution perspective, then we could stand to benefit.
All right. Thank you, Marithi. We're getting some comments here. Oh, you'll like this one, audience. We, the youth of Africa, understand. Send us. I assume that's to COP27. We nominate ourselves to speak and drive the climate agenda. We are ready. Agree? Yes. Right, okay. All those government delegations listening to this, we've got some ready victims here who are happy to go and negotiate their way through Sharm el-Sheikh. All right, and we've got a question here online. Can any panelists talk about the role of local government and their role in climate adaptation and climate resilience? That sounds like one for you, Ibrahim.
Yeah, I mean, before I get to that, Zainab, if I may just say a few words about it. I think somebody brought up a very good point, and that is we need to be less technical and be more simplistic in the way we actually explain the problem.
Yeah.
And I think in that regard, the three things very quickly I want to mention. Number one, climate-related disasters or climate change does not mean the same thing to all the African countries. There's not a one-size-fits-all. In some countries, it's drought, tropical cyclone. In other parts, it's flood. So it's really important to be actually mindful of the differences of our countries so we don't actually lump all this into one box and hoping that we can find a miracle solution. I think number two, it is important to highlight there is some existing innovative African initiative in dealing with resilience. My program is one of them. We need to do more of that so that at least we can get as many initiatives as possible to help Africa to deal with the effect of climate change. I think third, extremely important, I think platform like this, the more Ibrahim is putting forward, it's a great platform where we can bring different players around the table, have this very constructive conversation, and not wait for the rest of the world to come to our rescue. And I think if we can do more of this, we can have the right type of conversations. With regard to the local governments, it is important, as I say, that the conversation at the country level, it's not just at the national government. For example, in my program, in any countries where we intervene, we make sure we bring around the table the different ministries, different local government, different city halls around the table to have a conversation, so we can localize the conversation as opposed to making it too global. And I think that's where we're trying to be relevant to the countries. And I am strongly a favor of organizations like Mo Ibrahim. Why not? To actually decentralize this conversation at the level where we can get the perspective of local government. And that's when we get to the real problems.
All right.
Over to you.
Okay, Natasha, we've not heard from you for a while. Do you want to respond to some of the comments we've heard from the floor?
Absolutely. I think just two comments. One is we've talked about being less technical, but I want to also challenge us and say that we should also begin listening more. There's an assumption, and especially because climate change is a very elitist conversation. So the people in the room have gone to Harvard, Oxford, they have an accent, they're sipping tea at a particular restaurant. But the local person who is more affected by the effect of climate change is often left out of the conversation. And we assume that they don't understand the challenges that they're facing. So guys, why don't we first listen? Take note of what they're saying, because there's agency in that. We are acknowledging that they know they have solutions to their problems. But two, and most importantly, is what stories are we telling? And Emilia said this, and I think it's important for us, and I want to repeat this, that narrative matters. When you begin to say something over and over again, people begin to believe it. When you begin to tell Africans that they are the problem, they begin to believe it, and they begin to feel that they're victims, but we are not. We are able to take control of our future, and we need to begin telling stories of people in their communities, in local contexts who are doing that. There's an importance in storytelling, but most importantly, I want to go into local governments, and more often than not, even though there's decentralization, the challenge of local governments is that even though they're elected, oftentimes they're implementing what national governments are implementing. So I want to challenge us a bit, especially in the local context, to think of climate change responsive governance. And a lot of governments are thinking about gender responsive government and governance. Why don't we begin thinking around climate change responsive governance and ensuring that we are implementing policies at a local level that have local context and nuances that understand in particular regions? I am Kenyan, and Northern Kenya has different challenges from Nairobi. I cannot presume and assume that I understand what Northern Kenya is facing, because the drought that they're facing now is one they've never faced before. So localize and contextualize the challenges that each country is facing.
Okay, maybe you can throw light on this question then, Natasha, because we've had somebody say, and I don't know what the ins and outs are of this particular project. So if the government of Kenya is listening, apologies in advance if this question misconstrues what you are doing, but it says the government of Kenya promised to build a $20 billion dam, a 3 to 4 year project in Nyanza area on the River Nyando, affected by floods. What structures should we introduce to ensure that such significant projects are implemented? We want to do away with empty promises from people in the government. I understand a lot of people in that area are homeless because of the floods. So clearly one example there that demonstrates a lack of implementation that I think you referred to a little while back, Natasha. Do you want to comment on that, either specifically or generally, in general terms?
First, Sheikh, Zainab, I'm meant to be in London tomorrow, so I'm going to keep my comments as PG as possible. So I want to get on my flight. Second, I would be curious to know when the promise was made. It's election season in Kenya, so I'd be very wary to take anything to heart until after August. So I'd be quite curious to know when exactly the promise was made, because if it was made during this, I would ask us to dismiss it with the contempt it deserves. However, I will let Muriithi, because he's headed back to Nairobi. I would like to throw the baton to you.
But I mean, in a general point, as a general point, though, I mean, it's clear that you referred to the lack of implementation, even when the right, when a problem is identified and the right solution is also identified, there then is the lack of implementation, and that's a very key, problem.
Absolutely, and on a very serious note, when it comes to the dam, I think the question is, what research has been done around it and what policies are actually informing this decision. Because when it comes to Kisumu, water is actually a decentralized and devolved function. So this could be a promise or in partnership with Kisumu County government and the national government, in which I think there would be more context needed around that. However, I think when it comes to climate change and implementation, Kenya is one of the leading countries when it comes to policy making. However, when it comes to implementation, there's a huge gap. So my challenge, especially to the national government and whoever is going to take power in August, inshallah, it's a peaceful election, is that we ensure that we are not just stating things at the top, but it's implemented in every single policy, that we are actually taking it seriously.
Thank you. Thank you. A point from the floor. Yes, if you stand and identify yourself. Any more people want to make comments from the floor? Put your hand up or forever hold your peace. I am going to come to you, of course, Madame Aisha. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Fatima. I was born in Lisbon, but I'm an African from the Northwest. And it's not actually a question. It's more of, I might sound like someone that sips tea, but no. I just want to say if we all know in here that poverty is a money machine making, and so will be climate change. So as Fabrice said before, if we do not set our agenda, someone will set it for us. And we do see that NGOs are created almost in England every day, and to go to African countries. And all of these people, they make money in the end of the month. And we know that the African continent has an issue with job creation. So climate change will eventually be job creation. What I want to ask the leaders and billionaires of Africa is if it is possible to create a way, the same way that we have in Europe, to help Africans to create their own NGOs, to create their own grassroots organizations, and that they can, too, be part of the change in the continent and create jobs for people in the continent. Because the 100 billion will not come, but there are billions and billions that are always disposable if you have a project, if you have a plan, and if you come forward and pledge that to big institutions. We just have to start being smarter and do things like others do around the world.
Very interesting point. And you're right that the aid business is a very substantial one with major INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, who literally spend hundreds and hundreds of millions on their overheads, their salaries, and hundreds of millions on their marketing and publicity. And you're quite right in saying that that could be more effectively deployed on projects on the ground. Any more comments from the floor? I want to, you've already spoken, you kicked off for us.
I'm a local government expert, so I wanted to...
Okay, all right. We'll let you, as long as it's not too long, because I'm running out of time. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm a local government expert, and as I've already said, let's talk about climate change at the African context. When we take it to the local government, the narrative that we talk about at local government is climate change adaptation. And we have always played a key role. We play adaptation through different strategies. Like I have said, when you talk of climate change adaptation and development planning, how we build our how we construct our buildings, the provision for water harvesting, how we advise our communities on how to construct their buildings, that's climate adaptation. So this is the key role that local governments play. And then also when we come to our way of farming or our agricultural farming in the background, because I have taken local climate change to the local communities to tell them about the backyard gardening, where you don't need to have large amounts of water to use for farming to produce your own food in the background. So local governments play a key role in climate adaptation through construction methods, through urban design, the way we design our cities, because I am an urban planner working for local government, the way we design our cities has got an impact on climate adaptation. So the narrative at local level is climate adaptation more than the mitigation, because the mitigation is for the developed world.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And that's the point that I made earlier on, yes. I mean, how do you mitigate 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions? You can talk about, I don't know, China with its 30% greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation there, or Europe's 10%, but Africa's 3%. I want to hand over now. Comment from the floor from the distinguished Madam Aisha Badiallo, who is a former Minister for Education in Guinea-Conakry and a great mover and shaker.
I was hoping that my daughter from Botswana would have talked a little bit more about indigenous knowledge. When I was young, whenever a baby was born, a tree was planted. That is something which is very important. That child would water that tree. Will he cut it or allow anybody else to cut it? No. So I wanted you to talk about it. And then I was also...
You still do that, Aisha.
That's my problem. I have left a long time ago. So I was hoping that they would talk about it.
Okay.
But I hope that, anyway, since I'm going back home, I will ensure that it will start again. I was also hoping that the young people would talk about the extraction of minerals in our countries. For instance, when they extract bauxite, there is a lot of pollution, water pollution, environment pollution, river, whatever. And the people in the grassroots are talking about, complaining, but the government is doing anything. And the resources that come out of the extraction of these minerals are not coming to them. So what will you do? Will you denounce it or not? That's what I would like them to do. Because the people have complained, but their voices have not been heard. Will you young people help us, these voices to come, complain, and make sure that it will not happen? Or less pollution? You have big holes, trees cut. It's awful. And the powder of the bauxite is killing the trees. So no fruit, no water, drought and whatever. The young people have to do something. Government will not do it. I'm sorry.
Really?
They are not. So the voices should come from, the civil society, from the youth. You are our young generation. So
it's interesting. I mean, it's really, let's come to our closing comments from my final panelists here. I mean, one message that has clearly resonated, and Ibrahim, you've got a lot of lobbying to do, is that African governments, clearly you've heard from the younger generation and also from a great stateswoman of Africa, Madam Aisha, that African governments really are not going to do it. So just your closing comments, and then I'd like to get some brief remarks from Mo Ibrahim about what he's heard in this conversation. It is, what African national governments should be doing, both in delivering for their own people, what they should be doing on the international stage, how that's done, what they should be asking for, speaking in one voice. There's a huge deficit here, really, that has been aired. And I want to ask all of you just some brief final remarks on how you would really leverage Africa's voice and presence at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. How would you go about doing that? Marithi, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Zainab. And just to say briefly, the last question on River Nyando was very striking because, just going back to the question of knowledge and traditional ways of adapting. I remember back in high school, during football and rugby games, there was a song that talked about River Nyando, and it said something like, River Nyando is not navigable. Just because it's a huge, mighty river that floods a lot of the plains in Western Kenya. So you can see that there's knowledge about the problem, but the question is the leap to resolution. The leap, as Natasha says, from policy making to making sure that you have a dam. There's been a long-standing plan, for example, to have rice cultivation on a larger scale to help tame the waters. So, the resolutions are within reach. You can grow pasture, for example, when the rainy season comes, rather than having livestock herders move from place to place during the dry season. So the resolutions that we then grasp, I think what we need to do is have greater coordinated action and really people to appreciate, given the statistics we've all had, that this needs to be at the center and at the beating heart of policy making.
All right, thank you. Greater coordination. Natasha Kimani, your closing remarks.
Yeah, I just want to comment one thing about what Madam Aisha said, and what a lot of policymakers often tend to say is that young people need to fix the problems created by our leaders. And I think sometimes that is extremely unfair. Like, we found ourselves in this mess, and then, okay, now the burden is upon us to fix what our policymakers have failed. And I want to flip that and say that I hope that the young people hold our leaders accountable, because that is another way of taking control of the future. But most importantly, I hope that we can change the narrative, because there is evidence to show that Africans are taking part in climate action in their own way, but in a language that does not fit the intellectualized concept of climate action. And I think it's important for us to change and shift the narrative and highlight the important ways that Africans are shifting the narrative. Okay. Lastly, funding follows functions. Yeah. We have policies. We need to ensure that we're directing all funds to effectively implement the policies that we've legislated.
Okay, thank you. Briefly, Amelia Siwingwa.
COP27 is a real opportunity for Africa to switch the narrative on the climate crisis. It's time for African leaders to bring the African voice, and this will require inclusion. I like the fact that people spoke about delegations that include youth. It's time to also include the rural woman's voice, youth voices as well, to COP27. Second, when it comes to the issue of financing adaptation, one of the things that's happened in development is that accountability has been built in through the banks. For instance, independent accountability mechanisms in the World Bank, in the African Development Bank, etc., enable Africans to be able to seek accountability for projects which ordinarily they would have no voice in. So it's time not only for the leaders to have empathy, but it's time for us as Africans to also demand accountability intelligently.
Thank you, Amelia. And penultimate word to you, Ibrahim.
Well, just to say a couple of key messages to me are important. Number one, all of us have a responsibility in making sure that the human face of climate change is not lost in the debate. I think whatever way we can do to tell the story in the way that people understand the people behind what we're talking about right now, that's something extremely important as we march to COP27. I think number two, there is this impression that you can't do three things at the same time. You can do resilience, adaptation, and mitigation at the same time. It's important that we underscore the importance of multitasking as we work COP27 so we can protect life and livelihood. I think last 2 points, not one institution alone can do this. So smart and strategic partnership is the way to go. The Africans are in the forefront in leading, but we can also work with the rest of the international community and make sure the African voice is heard. For us to be successful, three things very quickly: commitment, investment, and leadership. Commitment in terms of us keeping our commitment and investments being promised, funding so that we can channel them to the adaptation project that's required, and leadership so that African Union and African Development Bank and other institutions could be in the forefront in making sure the African voice is heard so that nobody is left behind.
Okay. Thank you so much indeed. Mo, come and join me on the stage, please, just for the final couple of minutes or so. We heard a lot of comments flying around there, didn't we, Mo? I don't know what you made of it, Africa and climate change.
First, I'm really delighted because I noticed really that the majority of the participants in the debate are really young people. And that is wonderful. Yes, we need the expertise of Ibrahima and other people, but also this fight really concerns young people more than us, because I'm not going to be there when we reach 1.5 degrees. You guys are going to be there. You're going to suffer.
But you heard what somebody said, like the grown-ups, the older people, gone and messed up the kitchen and said to the young people, you clean up the dishes now. Yeah. That's not fair, is it?
It's not fair. But this world is not fair. And we have to accept that. And it's true. The past generation in Africa and elsewhere made a mess of a lot of things. I mean, there is no, but it is in your hands. You have to do that. So the point I was making, I'm delighted with the strong participation of young people in this debate, because that gives it a certain dynamic, I think was essential. I'm also impressed by the number of women really participating. Although I'm very surprised that none of them talked about clean cooking. Yeah? Because many African women die from the consequences of cooking using coal and using wood. And those guys need gas to cook. We have 900 million people in Africa live in households which really use coal. You are distracting me. Can you please sit down?
No, it's just because we've run out of time, but go on. You've got another panel about this tomorrow, remember, but go on, yes.
So anyway, I think that is an important issue. We have to remember how many women die because of unclean cooking. And that's on our watch. I heard a lot of attack on our leaders. And either they don't understand the issues, or they don't have the capacity, if they understand, to articulate the case. I have not much comment on that. I mean, it depends. There are some leaders who do, and I talked about the fight staged by Macky Sall, for example, clearly understand and is fighting for it. But some people actually really, I agree, don't understand this issue among many other issues. But stop complaining. I'm talking to young people now. Stop complaining about leaders, because you are the largest constituency in Africa. Vote them out. If you don't like them, don't come here and complain. Vote them out. Stand up for election. Okay? So you act. Don't sit back and complain. That's not fair. And to talk about whether the people who are suffering in Africa, usually mainly the peasants and farmers who really, their life has been completely disturbed. And whether those guys know about climate change or don't, yes, they know, but they don't necessarily understand it is man-made. That's the issue. It is man-made. Our people in rural areas will attribute everything to acts of God. Yeah? Rain came, doesn't come rain, let's go and pray to get more rain. Or they'll always don't link the act, what happens to man actions. And that is the gap here. They suffer, they know things are changing, but is it nature or is it man-made? What we need to tell them, actually, it is man-made, really, who are causing that. That is to link the gap. I'm going to stop here before my sister here starts
the time police here.
Okay.
No, thank you. That was really very interesting observations you made there. And in just under half an hour, you're going to be able to hear Mo Ibrahim in conversation with President Macky Sall of Senegal, who, of course, is the current chair of the African Union. But I want to thank Mo for arranging all this, and my four wonderful panelists, Amelia, Natasha, Ibrahim, and Marithi. Thank you so much indeed for your insights. And of course, you here in the room with me and Madame Aisha Badialo, and all of you who are listening to this online. It's been my pleasure to have joined you in this very, very important discussion. And until the next time, goodbye.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Thank you.